Welcome back to the Sherry Sylvester Show. My guest today is Matthew Watkins, who just took over as editor-in-chief at the Texas Tribune. As soon as he got the job, I pinged him and asked him to be my guest, and I'm delighted that he came right over. Matthew joined the Tribune in 2015 and has held various roles, including higher education reporter, breaking news editor, politics editor, and managing editor. Matthew guided the Tribune's reporting of election and legislative coverage. The Tribune's won lots of awards, and Matthew's played a key role in all of them. The Texas Tribune launched on election night in 2009 and has become one of the most successful digital news operations in the country and the primary producer of public policy and legislative news content in news outlets around the state, serving as a kind of wire service to Texas newspapers, radio, and TV. They also frequently partner with the New York Times. For those of us who advocate for conservative policy in Texas, the Texas Tribune frequently brings a daily dose of low-grade anger. Despite the fact that they're very nice people, we always believe that they're not moving beyond the narratives that are rooted left of center, even though they're covering a state that is decidedly conservative. Matthew, welcome. I'm so glad to have you. You're a native Texan, an Aggie, a veteran of the Dallas Morning News. And now that you're in the big chair up the street, I want to hear about your plans for your tenure. But, you know, what I really want to know is, what do you think about bias? What do you think about, is this something, we talk about it a lot in this building.
Sure.
Because we're conservatives, we've got our own media networks. And we just wonder if anybody's paying attention to us anymore.
Right. It's a good question, and I know it's a big topic of conversation, right? I mean, we at the Tribune aspire to be nonpartisan, right? We aspire to be fair to all sides in every way we can. I think it is, you know, the traditional idea of media, right, is that you don't bring your own kind of personal perspective into the reporting. And we try to do that as much as we can while also acknowledging that in some ways that's not possible, right? I mean, everyone kind of has their own lived experience through which they view life, right? And if you know, there's no way to completely remove yourself. And when you're making decisions about what's a story, what's not a story, all that kind of thing. But that being said, we're going to try as much as we can to be fair. I'm a big believer in the idea of you need to understand where people in power, where people from all different areas of the political spectrum are coming from, whether you agree with them or not. You know, especially in the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation in media about, you know, should you not give, you know, an amplifying effect to certain views that certain people may view as kind of outside the mainstream or anything like that. And, you know, one, it's hard, you know, someone's definition of what the mainstream is or what is an acceptable view may vary pretty widely. But besides that, I mean, if we're in a place where we're covering people in power, I think everyone, whether you're the most liberal person in the state or the most conservative in the state, need to understand where those folks are coming from, where the, you know, what's driving the decisions, what people are thinking, what they're trying to do, right? And so my view is what the Tribune should be doing is we should be taking every effort, stopping, you know, at nothing really, to try to understand and get the perspective and hear the perspective of those people. It's something that I'm definitely going to be pushing, you know, in my time in office. But I also just think it's not even necessarily about fairness. I think fairness matters and is important, but it's about what do our readers need, and they need to have an understanding of the world as it exists, not as the world as we wish it would exist. You know what I mean?
It's interesting. Have you met the new public editor over the Dallas Morning News?
I've not, no.
Stephen Buckley. I've not met him either, but he's on my list to meet. But he wrote in his opening statement to the paper is that he recognized that there was a bias and that conservatives viewed the paper as biased. And he said he also recognized that conservatives don't need the Dallas Morning News, but he said we need conservatives.
Right.
And so in your inaugural statement, you made this, you wrote a sentence that I wanted to push back on. You said, you're talking about your coverage of the border, and you've been down there and covered the border. I've been down the border a lot. You said, We won't shy away from pointing out government failures there and real pressures these communities feel, and will do so with fear tactics, and will do so without the fear tactics designed to score political points.
Right.
What are fear tactics designed to score political points? What do you see down there?
I think, there are oftentimes where certain people with political aspirations or motivations, I guess I would say, or maybe even more so, attempts to gain attention and notoriety on social media.
Do you think that's what Abbott did with the busing?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I'm talking about more is like social media influencing type folks, right? Where you'll take a video or an image out of context and portray it to be something different than it actually is, or portray it with different levels of context. Like I would say, for instance, I've talked to enough people or heard from enough people or read enough people that there are real serious legitimate challenges in the border, and I don't want to shy away from those challenges is sort of what I'm saying. But I also want to explain what's happening here. I think this is not Texas related, so it's not something we've really covered, but what's going on in Ohio right now with the conversations around Springfield are a good example.
Or not going on.
Right, or not going on, exactly. There are certain clips that are sometimes being shown that are being heavily hinted or portrayed to be something than what it really isn't. I mean, there's one in particular that I'm thinking about, the picture of the gentleman carrying the goose down the street, right? And some people are taking that image and saying this is proof that Haitian migrants are eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. And from what I've been able to read, when I understand, again, this is not my expertise because we focus on Texas, is that that was not a picture from Springfield, and that what had happened was that was in the aftermath of a car accident where a goose had been hit by a car and someone was carrying it down the street to clear it out of the way. And so there's two ways to look at that. There's one way and say this is misinformation, this is bad, and in some ways I think that is in fact true. There's also an overcorrection there, and to say that this is fake, therefore whatever conservatives are saying about immigration is therefore illegitimate. And that is going way too far, right? And so what I'm trying to do, what I want the Tribune to do, is to find that space where we're seeing and recognizing legitimate concerns, grievances, problems, write about them fairly, but also not get kind of sucked into the morass of bad information that does seem to do fairly well in social media. And I think that is a big problem because, sometimes I think folks are doing that not even with the goal of even pushing a political agenda, but because, there's something about human nature, there's something about the algorithms of social media where that kind of information performs really well, and it helps you build your clout and get you attention. And that's something that I don't want us to participate in.
To drag in that. On the other hand, when Noray Jocelyn was killed in Houston, that was a Texas story.
Right.
That wasn't an immigrant that was in the country illegal, an illegal alien. That was real. And that was also dismissed by some fringes on the left as moving that for political points.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that? That wasn't political points. That little girl's dead.
Right. And it's a terrible story, of course. I think this is an interesting one. I mean, you may disagree with me here, but one thing that the Tribune has chosen to do from the very beginning is to really focus on the areas of our expertise, our coverage, right? We were created as an organization to cover politics and public policy in Texas. What we decided we were not going to do is we were not going to have a sports page. We were not going to have an arts and entertainment page. We were not going to cover local issues, including local crimes. So it's very rare that we will write about an individual murder without, if we're not talking about, a assassination or something along those lines. And so you're right, we did not we did not write about that story. That was the way we did. I understand that there will some who will say because this was an undocumented person who committed this murder, that it makes it a different type of story. You know, I'm open and interested in having that conversation, but there are, of course, you know, questions to be raised about that, about, you know, there is evidence in some cases that, you know, the undocumented population actually commits crimes at a lower rate. And so what does this mean? What did this individual case mean? Is a question that I'm not necessarily saying we would never write about, but it was not something that we felt in that circumstance highlighted a broader thing that was happening in this country in that kind of way.
Even though it corroborated one of the primary indictments on illegal immigration that's happening at our border. It was
right, which is what that that people with criminal backgrounds might be being allowed into the country.
Among the millions that are coming through. I don't think anyone is saying that everyone that's coming through has a criminal background.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be everyone. It could be a half of a percent.
Right.
Which is kind of where we are.
Right.
Well, now, if I call the Tribune left wing, it would probably annoy you, right?
It would, yeah.
Well, so let me see what your guy wrote last week when Lieutenant Governor Patrick put out 21 new interim charges.
Okay.
The new list includes many right-wing priorities and would escalate Republicans' wars against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and review laws to keep non-citizens off the voter rolls. Well, first of all, Abbott beat Beto by 1 million votes.
Right.
Patrick beat whoever he ran against by 1 million votes. 68% of Texans oppose, I have this little thing here, 68% of Texans believe all students should be treated the same at Texas universities without special programs for blacks, Hispanics, and gays. So that's not, DEI is not attacking DEI is not a right-wing thing, it's a Texas thing. So doesn't that fuel a narrative that there's these right-wingers that are somehow in charge, and certainly Patrick's one of them? And I'm going to get to the things you didn't cover on his list, but isn't that a term that's kind of incendiary, right-wing?
I don't know. I mean,
where do you put it?
You know, I guess what I would say is that I don't think there's really anyone disputing, including, I mean, you've worked for Dan Patrick. You can tell me if I'm incorrect, that he is, you know, on the right spectrum, right?
Me too, the proud right-winger.
Exactly. So I guess my question is, you know, that seems to me, I don't think he would dispute that he is, you know, promoting right-wing policies. I don't hear anything in that sentence, a pejorative in any way, right?
Okay.
It seems to me like this is you know, he has not made any kind of attempt to hide his politics, nor should he. He has the support of the voters, right? He won, and now he is taking that kind of action. And what I kind of view that story is highlighting those issues that he is, you know, has campaigned on all along. You know, I guess I think sometimes people can view the term right wing as a negative thing, and I'm certain that there are probably people on the left side who did read that way, right, and saw it and said, oh, you know, this is terrible. But I would hope and I would think that there are people who agree with those things, who would view it as, you know, just a statement of fact, and when they read it, they would say, you know, this is good. This is what I voted him in for.
What it makes me think about is 30%. I mean, I think the term conservative majority is a better description. And sometimes when I'm reading the Tribune, I'm thinking of the stories that got missed. So you talked about the DEI and you talked about the masks. One of the proposals that Lieutenant, in case every one of our listeners has not heard the new interim charges, was that you can't necessarily, if you're going to go out and protest, you can't cover your face.
Right.
Which to me is like, if I'm going to go out there and say, vote for Susie for president, or, vote for Bill for Congress, you're standing up for something. So is talking about that. But there were some amazing things on that list, including something we've been dealing with in Texas for a long time, rape kits, cleaning up the messes of rape kits. Several pieces of legislation, K through 12 pathways, advanced placement, dual credit. So if you've got kids and you've paid for them to take dual credit courses in high school, sometimes they get to college and those courses aren't credited.
Right.
So he wanted to look at that. Post-pandemic enrollment trends, which are way down. Protecting vulnerable Texans in emergencies. I think this is probably something he learned was brought home to him during the last hurricane. Seniors, people that are disabled, people in assisted living, not having services that they needed. Moving the Texas moving picture industry forward. He hosted at the Bullock Reagan, the movie Reagan, at the Bullock, and they showed the piece with Matthew McConaughey and Billy Bob Thornton and Owen Wilson, and all begging that Texas appropriate more money for film because Reagan was made in Oklahoma. So we wanted to move that. So that's a story.
Yeah.
All of those things are Texas Tribune stories. And they get lost with the cut line under the thing with the picture of Patrick, and he's going after DEI, which everybody in Texas wants.
Right.
So
yeah,
that's not really a question.
No, I hear you on that, because I mean this is a challenge that I think all media deals with, and I think I will include the Tribune in this, right? Is that the more sensational stuff often gets more attention, right? And I don't know what to think about that. I think you have to, in some ways, use your news judgment to decide, like, what are people going to care about the most. But you can't, and I think that those were the decisions that the reporter made in that story. And I think that's a justifiable decision. But you did list off quite a few very important kind of issues here that I suppose did not get mentioned in that story. I'd have to go back and look to make sure, but I suppose did not get mentioned in that story. And I think some of those are very important. So you mentioned K through 12 pathways. We have actually just in the last year or so hired a new reporter whose job is actually her job is called Pathways Reporter, and her job is to kind of cover from kindergarten through getting your job. What is the pathway to getting a career? And what I kind of tell her, her name's Sneha Day, is the reporter.
Oh, I know her. And she was on higher ed before, right?
Right. Yeah. And what I tell her is that I view that job as a sort of keeping your eye on the ball job, because to me, and I think to a lot of people, and it sounds like including Dan Patrick, one of the most important issues in the future of this state is how are we preparing our workforce for their career, right? We live in a state where 60% of the K through 12 students right now are economically disadvantaged, or I'm sorry, I think 40% economically disadvantaged. 60% are not graduating college ready in math or English, or both. Other students, 25% are English is their second language. So there are a lot of challenges to educating our state populace, right? And in order to have jobs for the future, you need people with credentials, with training and everything like that. And so her job particularly is to focus on that question and telling those stories. And so, I will tell you, whether or not it was the right decision to not include that in that initial story, there will be coverage of those issues and those initiatives during this upcoming legislative session. I know that there's a hearing next month related to the movie industry, something that I find very interesting. We plan on covering that too. So those stories are going to get attention from us for sure. It is a challenge because often those stories don't get the same level of attention from our audience or even from the politicians covering the Tribune, right? And so, we'll write this one story that makes folks really upset and they'll get all worked up about it. And it's like, well, we also wrote this story and maybe you read it and didn't comment, or maybe you skipped over it. Hopefully, I think there will certainly be stories from time to time in our publication that upset conservatives. There will also be stories in our publication that will upset liberals. It is true that conservatives are much more powerful and influential in this state. So we're probably going to cast a, skeptical eye toward power more often than people less in power. So you might say that there might be more stories that are upsetting to conservatives or the conservative leadership than there is for Democrats because of that reason. But my hope is that the whole body of work of the Tribune will show a well-rounded picture of Texas, and that will include some of the good things the state government is doing, some of the failures of the state government, and some of the, frankly, neutral things of who's winning and who's losing and all of that. And my goal is that, come May 2025, at the end of the legislative session, I'll be able to point to you and say, here's some of the stories you might not have liked, here's some stories you did like, and here's some stories that you probably have no opinion about. Yeah.
What do you think? I've just got one more on my
Sure.
list that I want to hit you about. But one of the things that Buckley said at the Dallas Morning News, that he said sometimes he didn't believe that all the voices that could be included were included. And I think in the war over school vouchers, which we can now call school vouchers, because the hobby poll showed very clearly it didn't matter what we called
Right.
it. People support them across the board. And I wonder, so here's how it looked to me in terms of the narrative on that. You all called them vouchers all along, and you talked a lot to superintendents, as you said. You talked a lot to teachers, as you said. Were you surprised when you saw that the dynamic had shifted and the state actually is rallied around school vouchers?
I will tell you, this is an interesting one because there are circumstances where the legislature doesn't necessarily reflect public opinion.
Get out.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And I would say, for instance, if you look at gun laws in some ways, Texas is a very gun-friendly state, don't get me wrong, but if you look at the polls, there is more openness to, slightly more restrictive gun regulations than there are now. But the legislature, that's a complete non-starter.
Right.
The sort of opposite is happening, or I guess maybe it's the same as happening here with vouchers, right? Was, up until maybe now, or, at least November, there was not majority support, at least in the House, for vouchers. But it is clear that you're right. The polls are not ambiguous, and we've written about these polls and actually angered quite a few liberals for the way we've covered it. The polls say that there is support for this in Texas, but the legislature has not gotten there yet. And so is that surprising to me? A little bit, but these things do happen in the legislature, right? There are incentive structures with the way we are legislative districts are apportioned. There are with the way the primary system works, where the decisions by a whole body might not necessarily completely align with the public opinions of voters as a whole.
So you wrote a big story about ESAs, school choice, kind of being the product of religious conservatives who had been committed to it for a long time.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. But do you feel like you had the voices of, you guys have got a lot of expertise, but I can't tell you how many experts on parental empowerment that we have just in this building, just in our network, and maybe one of us will show up in a story. And one of the things, did I just say this, that Buckley said, is that when you think you're an expert on something, you're less likely to go after other experts. You think you already know the topic. Do you, it's interesting to me. I have been quoted a lot more in the Chronicle for higher education than I've been quoted on higher ed policy than I've been quoted in the Trib. Do you think that y'all think you know it, and so you don't need to call us, or maybe get one line from us?
I think, I would say that let's talk about the voucher issue first in particular, and then I think the question you ask is worth discussion as well. I think on the voucher issue, we've written about a lot of different perspectives of folks who like it. The religious right, of course, being one of them. The Catholic Church, which doesn't quite fit neatly into a political box, being another one. We actually wrote, that reporter I mentioned earlier, Sneha Day, wrote a story ahead of the special session last year about a family or a group of black mothers in Dallas who really felt like their kids were not being treated well in school and wanted to use their vouchers to create their own kind of mini school. And so I actually think in that situation we have taken an effort to tell a lot of different perspectives. I do think that there are, significant questions to be asked about vouchers too, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. If I remember correctly, the original Senate bill was targeting at around $500 million for vouchers last year. If you're talking about $8,000 per student, that only covers like a quarter, basically, of the current private school students in Texas right now, right? So I think there's real questions about like where does the price tag go from here? Is this amount of money going to be enough for people, and what are the budget implications all along? I think those are all valid and legitimate questions for us to be asking too. But, I think we have tried very hard to get at that story from all different angles, the positive and the negative. I think to your broader question, I will concede to you, like, I think we need to do a better job of getting conservative perspectives into the Texas Tribune. I believe that to be true, and it's something that I think we need to work on. It's tough because there's a lot of conservative skepticism toward the media, and as a whole, and at the Texas Tribune as well. And, we can go back and forth as to who started that all that, right? But ultimately, it doesn't matter.
No.
Because we need to reflect the views of state leadership in our coverage. We need to reflect the views of the majority of voters in our coverage. And whether that's reaching out more to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, whether that's, trying to, as hard as we can, to build relationships with state leaders and interview them and things like that. I think we do need to do more than that, because right now, a lot of times what will happen, you've experienced this, I'm sure, a reporter sends an email to Public Official A's press office. Public Official A does not respond. The reporter puts Public Official A did not respond to comment for this story and thinks their job is done. And that's not acceptable. Like, we need to do more. There are other people who will talk to us. There are public pronouncements that they've made. We can and should do a good faith effort to portray that perspective. And again, I go back to it. It's not just because we need to be fair. We do need to be fair, but it's because everyone, liberal and conservative, needs to understand what's driving these folks, what's causing them to vote the way they do and push the priorities they're choosing to push. And we're doing just as much of a disservice to our liberal readers as we are to our conservative readers if we're not including that. But it requires work. And it's something we're going to continue to work on.
Yeah, it's the hard piece. And I think that, you talked about the failure of our schools, and I think we're in agreement there. And I've two points on this, but I don't understand why we don't come together. Half the kids in our schools are not reading or doing math at grade level.
Yeah, right.
Let's talk about that.
Right.
And, the ESA program, could it do worse than what they're doing? That's a question to ask. And you talked about in your email, we talked to teachers, we talked to superintendents. What are you asking them?
Yeah.
Why? Is there any response other than we want more money?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? And it's a complicated question, right? Because it's not easy, and there are a lot of things that are happening outside of those school walls that are affecting this too. I was just recently getting coffee with a education journalist based in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, they love to tout they're kind of like number one,
right? Yeah.
And she was telling me basically, Massachusetts is doing just as bad of a job of educating the poorest students, the students who don't speak English as a first language, as Texas is or California is or wherever else. So much of this is demographics. So much of this is the wealth, the education level, the English language skills of the parents, and what kind of resources are available to students in order to grow up around books. Or if your mom's working a job late at night, she's not laying in bed with you reading you 3 stories before you go to sleep, and some of those things are out of the control of the schools, right? So I think to go back to your question, like I think there is more that could be done about kind of how our schools are failing, or where our schools are failing, but also how our schools are being failed, right? It's a complicated issue. If it weren't complicated, it probably wouldn't be an issue, right? And I think, to me, education is, going back again to being kind of keeping our eye on the ball, one of the most important topics that the Tribune and other media can be writing about in the state right now.
And it's you say you're committed to being nonpartisan. It's very hard to be nonpartisan when you're talking about education, because you've got people that are very happy to talk to you. They're the teachers unions.
Yeah.
They're the biggest supporters of the Democrat Party. So you get pulled into that, and it's tough. And then you, I'm sure, are aghast to come at the end of the week and find that you've been pushing a left-wing narrative all week coming out.
I think there's something that we as journalists have to be careful about painting with a broad brush, right? Because you're right, the teachers' unions are liberal, right? They just are. And they purport to represent the teachers in Texas. And in some ways they do. But something I tell our reporters is, like, you can't always assume that the loudest voice in a community is the most representative voice in a community. That's often not the case, right? And there are plenty of teachers in Texas who are very conservative, very, skeptical of government, and don't really want to associate themselves at all with the unions. And so, we've got to be careful not to say teachers don't like Greg Abbott when it's really, this organization doesn't like Greg Abbott.
Right, yeah. A couple more questions I want to ask you. What are media in the time, even in the time that I've known you, which has been since I was working for Patrick, and maybe before that, maybe at TLR, so 10 years or something. Lots of changes in media.
Yeah.
Who are you looking at? I mean, the Barry and the Free Press is a big deal now. You guys just got off TribFest. I wasn't there, so I don't know who came in. But what do you think's happening, particularly in a field where the Tribune pioneered digital stuff? What are you looking at now? What do you see coming up?
Yeah, one of I would say the big changes is, it's actually not ideological at all. It's how people get their information, right? When I started at the Tribune in 2015, Facebook was perhaps our biggest driver of traffic, and Twitter wasn't far behind, right? And Facebook made a specific decision to de-emphasize news on their algorithm. And so our stories barely show up on Facebook anymore, which is fine. Like, they're a private business. They're entitled to do it. This is not a complaint.
Right, yeah.
But it causes us to then have to think about, okay, how are we going to reach people? And, when I started out as a journalist, we still sort of viewed ourselves as gatekeepers of information, right? Some person shows up at the public comment period of a city council meeting and says, like, there's aliens in their basement or whatever. You're just like, okay, we're just going to ignore that. We're not going to give oxygen.
Unless, of course, there's a picture of him with a duck.
Right. Yeah. We're not going to give oxygen to this nonsense or whatever. And that's not how it works anymore, right? I mean, going back to the picture of the duck, that's going to spread whether we ignore it or not.
Right.
And so what we have got to try to do is try to focus on, pay attention to what people are talking about, try to give them good facts and information about that, and deliver it to them where they are, and not just, passively wait for them to see it on their Facebook feed or to go to texastribune.org. And that's a lot harder because the other thing that's changed is that when you were a newspaper in 1997, your competitor was maybe the other newspaper in town, the TV news, some magazines and things like that. Now our competitors are all those things, but TikTok, Facebook, Netflix, anything that can vie for your attention. You used to see all those pictures, like people sitting in the subway, and like every single person in the subway was reading a newspaper. Now every person in the subway is reading their phone, and most of those people on their phone are not reading news on their phone. They're playing a video game, or they're watching a TV show or whatever. And so that creates a situation where it's just harder to reach people anymore. And we have to, as the Tribune and every other organization, I'm sure this is things that y'all are thinking about too, find ways to meet people where they are, make it feel like they're not being preached to, that we're giving them good information, so that when they see whatever is going on in Springfield, Ohio, not a good example, whatever is going on with school vouchers, and they want to know more, they can trust that they can go to the Tribune and get good, reliable information to really understand what's going on.
In addition to TPPF.
Exactly, and TPPF and the Texan and a bunch of other places. Yeah.
Yeah, the change so rapid. Just an image to throw out before we wrap up. When I was at the Express News, I had come in from working in New York, New Jersey, where I felt where it was very exciting because you were competing with really the whole media world.
Yeah.
The Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, all of that media corridor, and so you were really fighting to get the story first. And so when I walked into the Express News, they had every morning, they would have the front pages of the Dallas Morning News, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the Houston Chronicle, all of them up.
Yeah.
And they were all exactly alike. And I was like, I don't get this.
Yeah.
Why should I write a story that somebody else has already written?
Yeah.
Well, it's not in our paper.
Right.
So it's totally different.
Right.
Well,
and I was just going to say, in some ways this is good, right? Because there are a lot of stories that the media ignored that they can't ignore anymore.
Right.
And that's not always a bad thing. And frequently it's often a good thing, because we might have less of an ability to control the agenda. But that means there's a lot of other people who, if something's really important to them, they can get people to pay attention to it and think about.
Yeah, it's true. Well, listen, I want you to succeed, Matthew. I want you to succeed over there, and I want the Tribune to be a place where people know that they can get a variety of viewpoints that they can count on. How can we help you? You've got my cell phone number, but what can conservatives do?
I think start a dialogue, right? Let's try to talk to each other more. Give our reporters a chance. If the phone call comes, answer it, tell them how you feel. If they then write a story that you think is completely unfair and unbalanced, then I can't blame you for not wanting to talk to them again. But I feel like if we're not talking to each other, we're not going to fix this problem. And so my hope, and it doesn't just fall on you or other, our elected officials or anything like that. It falls on the reporters to really make a sincere effort to talk to each other, hear each other, and not assume the worst of each other in a way that hopefully can make things more productive.
Matthew, thanks for coming over. Appreciate for you walking up the street and joining us on the Sherry Sylvester Show. You can subscribe to the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Sylvester1630. And if you'd like to receive the 9th in Congress newsletter, you can sign up at the TPPF website, www.texaspolicy.com/9th in Congress. See you next time.